All right, here we go. I'm going to preface this by saying I'm not a biblical scholar, and I've not played one on TV.
Darn, you don't have all that pocket money.
I know, you know.
Pockets?
I got a script in my hand, though. I could probably start today.
Yeah. Do you have any CDs you want to sell?
I'll get back to you on that.
Okay.
A book. Yeah, I've got a book.
Maybe
Yes.
t-shirts.
Yes, and maybe some T-shirts and maybe even some fuzzy dice with my picture on it.
Stop.
Well, the fuzzy dice may be going a little far.
Okay.
All right, all
Well,
right.
as my fame
Yeah, okay.
departs.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's start it out as a work based on the prophecies of Daniel, because we were talking about Daniel the last few weeks with Sam. It kind of got me curious as to some of the stuff that was being hinted at in the prophecies of Daniel. So I started researching it. And of course, you guys know I've kidded a lot about, well, you know, if I ever get my chance to speak, we're going straight to the Apocrypha, the Song of Solomon, flannel graph, you know, all that crap. And, you know, it was all funny and stuff, but, well, I did find a little nugget in there, but that's not really where I'm going today. So if you were thinking I was going someplace, you might be disappointed. Anyway, I wound up following the reconstruction of the Second Temple, which was just getting its start right after Daniel had actually passed on. Followed the construction of the Second Temple to the point where it was destroyed again after Jesus. And some of those events are documented in the Maccabees, so that kind of gives me my little bit of that Apocrypha, but only in the historical sense, not as a teaching sense. So I thought I'd also speak a little bit about Hanukkah, which is in that as well, again, mostly as a historical perspective of it, but you can back up and see God's hand in a lot of these things. Even if the Bible is kind of silent during this period, there are still events that you could see God's hand at work, fulfilling his prophecies, fulfilling his plans. But for me, also being kind of the history person, I hadn't heard too much about this period of time between, say, the rebuilding of the temple and then Jesus coming on the scene. So that was kind of where I was going with this. So I'm going to be starting around the start of the construction of the Second Temple, which was completed a few years after Daniel, being completed in about 516 BC. So I'm going to kind of back up a little bit to talk about King Cyrus, which we were talking about in Daniel 10:1. In Daniel 10, verse 1, and I think verse 1 through 3. In the third year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a thing was revealed unto Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar. And the thing was true, but the time appointed was long, and he understood the thing, and had understanding of the vision. So Daniel was alive at the time of the start of the resettlement of Jerusalem, but didn't live to see the reconstruction of the Second Temple. You know, he was kind of on the aged side. He was one of the number of people who stayed behind in Babylon. The ascension of Cyrus the Great of the Persian Empire in 559 BC made the reestablishment of the city of Jerusalem and the rebuilding of the temple possible. When the Jewish exiles returned to Jerusalem following a decree from Cyrus in Ezra 1 through 4, construction started at the original site of Solomon's temple. After a brief halt due to opposition from some of the peoples there in the land who didn't really want to see any of this go down, let's see, I lost myself here. Anyway, these people had kind of gotten into the power struggle with the people who were in charge of reconstructing the temple of like Ezra and Nehemiah. In Ezra 4, work resumed about 521 BC under Darius, Ezra 5, and was completed during the 6th year of his reign in 516 BC, with dedication of the temple taking place the following year. Didn't really talk too much about Ezra because there's quite a bit of reading involved, and I'm not really teaching so much out of Ezra. But we do want to talk about a little bit more about Cyrus, because he was quite the guy back in the day who really did facilitate the Jews going back. And even Isaiah had a little bit to say about Cyrus. in Isaiah 45:1. Thus says the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whom he has taken by his right hand to subdue nations before him and strip the loins of kings, to force gateways before him that their gates will be closed no more. I will go before you, leveling the heights. I will shatter the bronze gateways, smash the iron bars. I will give you the hidden treasures, the secret hoards, that you may know that I am the Lord. And we know Cyrus is the Lord's anointed, but not because he was anointed with oil, as the kings of Israel and Judah were, but because he was anointed by the Lord to be a king and was qualified by him for that office. And he was raised up by him to be an instrument of doing great things in the world, and particularly of delivering the Jews out of the captivity and restoring them to their land. He's also to subdue the nations before him, which was done. Actually, I never had any idea how many nations he had conquered until I was looking through it. And he had conquered the Syrians, the Assyrians, Arabians, and here's where we start delving into the weird name ones. Cappadocians, both the countries of Phrygia, the Lydians, the Carians, the Phoenicians, and the Babylonians, also with the Bactrians, Indians, Sicilians, the Sacae, Paphlagonians, and the Megadinians. I probably butchered them all, but that's okay, they don't care. Likewise, the Greeks that inhabit Asia, Cyprus, and Egyptians. He ruled all over Asia, and all of which the Lord subdued for him. For it was he that did it rather than Cyrus. It was he that clothed him with the strength and courage and gave him the skill of military affairs and success with victory. Another part of the verse talks about, I will loose the loins of kings. And a couple of you might remember the loose loin comment I made a number of years ago. But it talks about the Croesus, king of Lydia, and then Belshazzar, king of Babylon, by divesting them of their dignity, power, and government. And of course, the loosening of the loins in Belshazzar's case, he made a mess of himself when he saw God's hand on the wall. It scared him. I won't go any further, even though I want to. Anyway, by the handwriting on the wall, he was thrown into a panic, and the joints of his loins were loosened, and that's as far as I go with that. But I thought it was interesting, too, when Isaiah talks about the point where he says, to open for him the two-leaved gates, and the gates shall not be shut. The gates of the cities and palaces wherever he came to Cyrus were opened to receive him as their conqueror and sovereign. So really true of the gates of the palace of the king of Babylon. When the army of Cyrus was had gotten into the city, they came up to the king's palace, found the gate shut, but a clamor and noise being made. The king ordered to see what was the matter. Gates being opened for that purpose, the soldiers of Cyrus rushed in at that very moment and slew the king. It was remarkable as the gates were of brass, which is shut up the flowing of the river through the city. But that night they had been opened up, and then Babylon was taken, while the inhabitants were feasting and reveling, which had they been shut, it would have defeated Cyrus, but God in his providence ordered it to be so, as foretold in Isaiah. I hadn't really put all that together. I thought that was fascinating. A little bit out of Ezra 1:1, if you'd like to follow along, talk a little bit more about Cyrus. Now in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom, and put it also in writing, saying, Thus saith Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord God of heaven hath given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he hath charged me to build him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Who is there among you all his people? His God be with him, and let him go up into Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and build the house of the Lord God Israel. He is the God which is in Jerusalem. And whosoever remaineth in any place where he sojourneth, let the men of his place help him with silver and with gold, and with goods and with beasts, beside the freewill offering for the house of God that is in Jerusalem. Ezra 1:5. Then rose up the chief of the fathers of Judah and Benjamin, and the priests and the Levites, with all them whose spirit God had raised, to go up to build the house of the Lord which is in Jerusalem. And all that they were about them strengthened their hands with vessels of silver and with gold, with goods and with beasts and with precious things beside all that that was willingly offered. Also Cyrus the king brought forth the vessels of the house of the Lord, which Nebuchadnezzar had brought forth out of Jerusalem, and had put them in the house of the gods. Even those did Cyrus king of Persia bring forth by the hand of Mithridath the treasurer, and numbered them unto Sheshbazzar the prince of Judah. And this is the number of them: 30 chargers of gold, 1,000 chargers of silver, 29 knives, 30 basins of gold, silver basins of a second sort, 410, and other vessels 1,000. All the vessels of gold and silver were 5,400. All these did Sheshbazzar bring up with them of the captivity that were brought up from Babylon into Jerusalem. So Cyrus really had his hand in this, but he also knew where his power came from. But he also was tolerant of these other religions and favored especially people who had been subjugated by the Babylonians, restoring the temples and modes of worship. These people had allowed to, what am I trying to say here? He allowed the exiles that were in Babylon to return to their homelands. Obviously the Jews were really used this to their advantage because they had gotten permission to rebuild the temple via Cyrus. But, like everything else, Cyrus dies, everybody dies, and he was succeeded by his son Cambyses, Cambysses. Anyway, who was not mentioned in the Bible. Obviously, there's nothing to remember him by other than as a historical figure. But Darius, a distant relative, then rose to claim the kinship. He proved to be a strong monarch and a great organizer who ruled over his vast empire with a benevolent and peaceful hand. During the early years of his reign, the Jews, who had been hindered during the rebuilding of the temple after the time of Cyrus, finally completed this work without interference under a favorable decree from Darius, which you can read about in Ezra 45, 1 through 6, or 1 through 6, verse 15. Ezra 45, or is that a typo? Must be Ezra 4, verse 1 through 6, verse 15. So I got a typo here. In Daniel 8, I'm going to back up a little bit. Greece is referred to as a he-goat with 4 horns. The Grecia of Daniel 8:21 does not refer to the divided city-states of classical Greece. You can remember all the towns, all the cities were basically individual kingdoms at the time. But rather they refer to the later Macedonian kingdom that conquered Persia under Alexander. The Macedonians conquered the Greek cities and incorporated them for the first time into a strong united state. Alexander the Great, who inherited his father's newly expanded kingdom, set out to extend Macedonian dominion and Greek culture eastward and conquer the Persians. Prophecy represents the kingdom of Greece as following Persia because Greece never became united into a kingdom until the formation of the Macedonian Empire, which replaced Persia as the leading world power at the time. And it wasn't until Alexander's day could reference be made to the first king of Daniel 8:21 of a Greek empire who was a mighty king with great dominion. And of course, Alexander the Great, he didn't live very long. He ruled even shorter, but what he did do was quite impressive. He was born in 356 BC and he died 32 years later. He only reigned for 13 years. Most of the time he was outside of his home state of, I think it's called Macedon, or Macedonia. His conquest of nearly the entire known world resulted in one of the largest empires in ancient history. He overthrew the entire Persian Empire, Asia Minor, Egypt, and everything in between, including Israel. Alexander died undefeated in battle, but without a clear heir, which led to the division of his empire among his 4 generals, also prophesied in Daniel. But I want to talk a little bit more about his dealing with Israel here. In 332, Alexander besieged and defeated the coastal cities of Tyre and Gaza in his march toward Egypt. during his campaign, he turned towards Jerusalem. Alexander had already demanded men and supplies from the Jews who were under the rule of Alexander's mortal enemy, the Persian king Darius. The high priest Jaddua hesitated, saying that while Darius lived, they would honor their pledge. Because Alexander was angry and began a move on the city. Well aware of the danger, the high priest asked the people to pray to God for his mercy and protection. Then the historian Josephus says that this Jaddua had a dream as to how to entreat the Macedonian king. He and the other priests, dressed in their priestly robes and accompanied by others dressed in white garments, formed a procession that went out of the city to a carefully chosen place to meet Alexander. Alexander then did the unexpected. Alone, he approached the high priest and members of the procession and greeted them. When asked by one of his generals why he welcomed this group, Alexander replied, "I did not adore him, but that God who hath honored him with his high priesthood. For I saw this very person in a dream, in this very garment, when I was at Dios in Macedonia, who, when I was considering with myself how I might obtain the dominion of Asia, exhorted me with no delay, but boldly to pass over the sea to thither, for that he would conduct my army and give me the dominion over the Persians. Whence it is that having seen no other in that habit, and now seeing it in this person, and remembering that vision and the exhortation which I had in the dream, I believe that I may bring this army under the divine conduct, and shall wherewith conquer Darius and destroy the power of the Persians, and that all things will succeed according to what is in my mind." Josephus records that Alexander then accompanied the high priest into Jerusalem and the temple, where he offered sacrifice to God according to the high priest's direction, and magnificently treated both the high priest and the priests. Alexander's visit was capped by a briefing from the book of Daniel, written obviously several centuries earlier by this point, which had foretold the rise and conquest of Alexander. And when the book of Daniel was shown unto him, wherein Daniel declared that one of the Greeks should destroy the empire of the Persians, he supposed that himself was the person intended, and as he was then glad as he dismissed the multitude for the present. Which I thought that was really fascinating. I hadn't heard that before. So again, Alexander died not too much longer after that. The death of Alexander in 323 led to the breakup of his empire, as his generals fought for supremacy and divided the Middle East amongst themselves. Among the generals, Ptolemy secured control of Egypt and the land of Israel. Seleucus grabbed Syria and Asia Minor, and Antigonus took Greece. The land of Israel was a sandwich between the two rivals, and for the next 125 years, the Seleucids and the Ptolemies battled for this prize, which you might recall we talked about briefly with Sam a few weeks ago. The former finally won, the Seleucids, in 198 when Antiochus III defeated the Egyptians and incorporated Judea into his empire. Initially, he had continued to allow the Jews autonomy, but after some defeats at the hands of the Romans, he began a program of Hellenization that threatened to force the Jews to abandon their God for the Greeks' paganism. I'm going to speak a little bit about Hellenism here as far as it was dealing with the folks at the time. Hellenism encompassed more than a relationship between the ruler and the local economic elites. It also represented an enlightened worldview. Don't we have one of those today? Considered by many to be the wave of the future. It's amazing how this stuff kind of repeats itself. I'm just amazed at how this is coming about again. Anyway, nations who shut themselves off and did not confront the challenge of Hellenism were falling by the wayside because it was viewed as the wave of the future. The pressure to accustom your ways was quite intense in Judea. Therefore, the people of Judea had to decide whether the universalistic focus of Hellenism constituted a danger to their ancestral religion and its God, or whether it simply represented a more modern and progressive way of life that could be merged with Jewish practice. Again, that really sounds kind of familiar in some respects. So what was the appropriate response? To reform Judaism to kind of include the spirit of Hellenism, we'll take little bits and pieces of it and incorporate it into what we have today to make us feel good? Or do we assume a stance protective of our traditional, in this case, Jewish values? So anyway, the Jewish Hellenists chose the path of taking bits and pieces of Hellenism because they wanted to move beyond separatism and assimilate the positive aspects of Greek culture into Judaism. Okay, here's our quote from Maccabees. Brace yourself. As First Maccabees recounts, and this is from First Maccabees 1:11. In those days there emerged in Israel lawless men, the Jewish Hellenists, who persuaded many, saying, "Let us go and make a covenant with the nations that are around us, for since we separated ourselves from them, many evils have come upon us." Now, Hellenism became a political tool used by the Syrian Greeks to consolidate their power among the wealthy. In turn, the aristocratic elites who embraced Hellenism gained access to the social and economic prerequisites flowing to the citizens of a large Greek city, including the right to mint coins, take part in international Hellenistic events, and to receive protection from the city's founding ruler. Again, that all kind of sounds familiar. Anyway, the Jewish Hellenists used the secular power structures for their own benefit. First, Jason and then Menelaus were able to secure the position of high priest from Antiochus Epiphanes IV by way of monetary bribes and other ways. Yet the involvement of these wealthy Jewish aristocrats and priests in Hellenism complicates any assessment of the role of the Maccabees in the Bible or in the Apocrypha. Probably why it's not there. Whereas a liberator is generally one who frees a country from domination by a foreign power, the Maccabees seem to have liberated the loyal Jewish masses from the Hellenistic Jews and their Syrian Greek allies in the context of like a civil war. So the legitimacy of the Maccabean liberation therefore depends on whether the Hellenists are viewed as apostates or the Jews who have taken on some Greek ways. Anyway, Jason and Menelaus wanted to preserve aspects of Judaism that fit with Greek ideals, like a universal God, but to remove those parts of Jewish practice that separated the Jews from others, like the dietary laws, the Sabbath observances, circumcision. Some Hellenists continued to worship the Jewish God, but moved their worship to outdoor sanctuaries and sanctioned the pig as a sacrificial animal. You can see what's wrong with that. So Antiochus Epiphanes III backed down in the face of a lot of Jewish opposition to his effort to introduce idols into the temples, but his son, Antiochus IV, who inherited the throne in 176 BC, resumed his father's original policy without accepting the Jews. He defiled the temple by erecting an idol to Baal Shaman, the Canaanite counterpart for the Greek god Zeus, sacrificing a pig on the altar in the temple, and proclaiming himself to be a god. Some of the coins he minted had his features on the face of Zeus, along with the words Theos Epiphanes, meaning the God manifest. He also decreed that the law of God could not be studied under penalty of death. The Jewish males couldn't be circumcised, and everybody was forbidden to keep the Sabbath. A brief Jewish rebellion only hardened his views and led to the outlaw of central tenets of Judaism. He also opened the shrine the temple to non-Jews. So, all the Jews were just fit to be tied at this point. So, after marching through Jerusalem, soldiers started going out amongst the different towns, and when the soldiers reached the town of Modin, about 12 miles northwest of Jerusalem, they demanded that the local leader, Mattathias, if I can pronounce that one, the Kohen, the Kohein, member of the priestly class, be an example to his people in the town by sacrificing a pig on a portable pagan altar. The elder refused and killed not only the Jew who stepped forward to do the Syrian's bidding, but also the king's representative. Then, with a rallying cry, "Whoever is for God, follow me," Mattathias and his 5 sons, Jonathan, Simon, Judah, Eleazar, and Johanan, fled to the hills and caves of the wooden Judean wilderness. Of course, they were joined by others who supported them, mostly simple farmers dedicated to the laws of Moses, armed with only basic weapons and rocks, um, from the area. The Maccabees, as this family was called, which is like the Hebrew word for hammer, because of their decisive strikes, they kind of gained this nickname. Anyway, Mattathiah's sons, particularly Judah, became known as the Maccabees, and they fought a guerrilla war against the well-trained, well-equipped, seemingly endless forces of the mercenary Syrian army. In 3 years, the Maccabees cleared the way to the Temple Mount, which they reclaimed. They cleaned the temple and dismantled the defiled altar and constructed a new one in its place. 3 years to the day after Antiochus had desecrated the temple in 165 BC, they held a dedication of the temple with proper sacrifice, rekindling the golden menorah, and 8 days of celebration and praise to God. Proper worship had been reestablished. Of course, perhaps the most famous part of the story is what happened with this menorah, which I think you're all familiar with. When the Greeks entered the temple sanctuary, they contaminated all the oil. When the Maccabees defeated them, they searched and found only one cruse of oil bearing the high priest's seal. The cruse had enough oil for only 1 day's burning, but a miracle came to pass and it lasted 8 days. The following year, these days were declared a holiday to be celebrated with a saying of recitation from Psalms and Thanksgiving prayers. So there's your basic Hanukkah holiday, but it didn't really last so much back in those days. So the Maccabean struggle was also driven by issues of social class, because only the wealthy, the urban ruling class and large landowners, led by the priests, were citizens. The democracy of the Hellenized Jerusalem polis oppressed the vast majority of the Jews who were powerless. Even before the Antiochian persecutions, there were troubles existing between the zealots and those of the traditional faith, the urban craftspeople, the village dwellers, and all those folks, and then these free-thinking Hellenizers, suggesting that the Maccabees may have been liberators, but that they were also driven by some degree of self-interest. Again, that kind of sounds familiar today, too. You know, we have all these free-thinking people thinking, you know, they're enlightened and we're just a bunch of dumb Christians. You know, what do we know? We're holding to our faith. But, you know, in looking through this so far, you know, you really do see God's hand holding on to what he needed to do to keep things going. And just kind of stepping aside for a second here, you know, I always thought that I never knew the complete story of how the temple was preserved, and I really have the thing where I'm thinking that the temple had to still be standing for Jesus' time, for him to be there and work through some of his prophecies. And maybe I'm just off on a tangent here. But it's like it was preserved to at least be standing up through the time of Jesus so that they could fulfill his prophecies before it was destroyed. Again, if I'm off track, tell me. Please note there's a bunch of crickets sounding right now. Anyway, a year after the Maccabees' triumph on the temple, the Hellenists still refused to give up the fight. Displeased that these old-fashioned Jews were once again a religious power, and that the Torah had been reinstated in Judea, they repeatedly invited the Syrians to send more troops. Such nice folks. Anyway, political maneuverings in Syria on more than one occasion saved the Maccabees by frightening the Syrian commanders home after hurried peace negotiations with Judah to protect their personal positions. Yet the war dragged on for a generation of the Maccabees' sons. Eleazar died in one battle, and then 3 more of his sons lost their lives, including what was the seemingly invincible Judah, who had many, many, many victories. But in 142 BC, Simon, the last survivor of the Maccabee brothers, was recognized as a high priest and political leader by his own people. He severed bonds of allegiance to the Syrian rulers, got rid of the Greek garrison out of Jerusalem, and began to mint his own coins, supposedly the first time a Jewish state had done that. He was succeeded by his son, I almost wanted to say John, weird name, but I won't say that, Hyrcanus, Hyrcanus, we'll go with it, who established the Hasmonean dynasty. The first term introduced in the Talmud may have been Mattathias' family name from his grandfather Simon Hasmonai, or somehow designation meaning prince, possibly related to the position of priesthood. Anyway, taking hold of the kingship violated the people's trust because it transgressed the Torah. The Bible stipulated in Genesis 49:10 that the kingship would always rest with the tribe of Judah, as it did once David's line was established. This was also separated from the priesthood, which came out of the tribe of Levi, from Aaron's descendants, to balance the secular and the spiritual. The Hasmoneans were not in the line for either, though they usurped it. So moving along a little bit, a queen at the time, Salome Alexandra, who was queen from 76 to 67 BC. All right, this is where I needed the scorecard because there's a lot of weird names floating around, and I was kind of like, ugh. Anyway, she appointed her elder son, Hyrcanus II, I guess they like to recycle names, as the high priest of Judea. Her younger son, Aristobulus II, was determined to have the throne, and as soon as she died, he seized the throne. Hyrcanus, who was next in line to be king, agreed to be contented with being the high priest. Antipater, remember that name, the governor of Idumea, the Edom area, encouraged Hyrcanus not to give up the throne. Eventually, Hyrcanus fled to Aretas III, king of the Nabateans, and returned with an army to take back the throne. He defeated Aristobulus and besieged Jerusalem. Now, the Roman general Pompey, which probably you've heard of from history, just happened to be like next door over in Syria fighting against the Armenians. He sent his lieutenant to investigate the fuss going on in Judea. And both Hyrcanus and Aristobulus appealed to him for support. Hey, there's this big army next door, let's go hit him up. Well, Pompey wasn't diligent in making a decision about this, which caused Aristobulus to march off. He was pursued by Pompey and surrendered, but his followers close Jerusalem to Pompey's forces. Well, then the Romans then besieged Jerusalem and took the city in 63 BC. The priests continued with their religious practice inside the temple during the siege. The temple wasn't looted or harmed by the Romans. Pompey himself, maybe inadvertently, went into the Holy of Holies, and the next day ordered the priests to repurify the temple and resume religious practices. And okay, now remember Antipater? This is where I thought another interesting thing. I never heard much about it until I was looking into this. His family had been converted to Judaism during forced conversions by a Sadducee-influenced John Hyrcanus I. Antipater became a powerful official under the later Hasmonean kings and subsequently became a client of the Roman general Pompey when he conquered Judea. So basically they gave him legitimate reign over the countryside. Now you've heard of Julius Caesar. Well, he defeated Pompey in Egypt, but Antipater rescued Caesar in Alexandria with 3,000 men and the aid of some friends. And so for his demonstrations of valor, Caesar elevated Antipater to Roman citizenry, freed him from taxes, and showered him with honors and declarations of friendship, and was made chief minister of Judea with the right to collect taxes. The pro-Roman politics of Antipater led to his increasing unpopularity with the devout non-Hellenized Jews. Anyway, Josephus notes that with his newfound rights and honors, Antipater immediately began to rebuild the wall of Jerusalem that Pompey had destroyed when subduing Aristobulus. He established order by tempering civil disturbances in Judea and threatening to become a severe master instead of a gentle governor should the people grow seditious and unruly. Matters in Judea were at least relatively calm at the time. At this time, the defining point in Antipater's legacy came when he made his son Phasael, Phasael, governor of Jerusalem, and Herod, his other son, the governor of Galilee, which covered the area north of Samaria between the Sea of